All right, good afternoon everyone. For those of you that don't know me, my name's Simon Burgess and it's an absolute pleasure to be able to give you an overview of Vaucluse Agricultural Company and how we're managing crop rotations and the chemical management strategies within our business. I have to say from the outset that I was very reluctant to present today, as I definitely do not profess to be an expert in this area, but what I can do is give you an overview of what we're doing in our business. So firstly, a little bit of background on me. I've been with the business since Vaucluse was purchased in 2015. I've had a lifelong career in the agricultural and food sectors, both in Tasmania and interstate. And my true passion is agriculture. I absolutely love developing farm businesses, growing things, and particularly irrigation development and irrigated cropping. On a personal side, I'm a fairly keen cyclist, ocean kayaker and snow skier, and also quite partial to a good Tassie red. So current farm portfolio is 4,400 hectares owned, 376 hectares leased, with an off-site 5,400 tonne grain storage and handling facility. We're located around about 150 kilometres north of Hobart, which is our capital city, 45 kilometres south of Launceston, which is our major regional centre for banking, machinery, local airport, hospital and shopping. Fortunately, all of the land we manage is adjoining, apart from our grain storage and handling facility. We've got significant water assets with 2,600 hectares of irrigation and over 9,000 megalitres of stored water. Arability would be one of our biggest constraints, with 2,500 hectares out of 4,800 hectares managed. This year, we have a 2,350 hectare crop program made up of 1,100 hectares of cereals, which is 70% winter planted, 30% spring, 400 hectares of potatoes, of which 140 are leased out to other growers, 240 hectares of canola, 110 of that is grazing canola, 230 hectares of poppies, which is down from our steady state of probably around about 400 to 500 hectares, 120 hectares of legumes, 200 hectares hemp/fodder, and around 60 hectares of carrot seed, which is leased out to other growers. For us, it's particularly hard to get scalability in legumes for a good break crop, so we do use quite a bit of winter fodder as a break. Now, to explain that, this year we had 1,200 hectares of winter fodder in, so that's fodder that's planted straight after harvest in autumn, taken through and grazed over winter, and then goes into our spring crop program. So probably about as close as you'll ever get to double cropping in Tasmania. This year that was 500 hectares of fodder wheat, which we target in paddocks where there's, say, a radish issue or something like that, so we can just opens up our chemical program for that weed. 400 hectares of pasture, 300 hectares of tillage radish, which we try and use in paddocks where we want to do a bit of soil conditioning. On the livestock side of the business, we've got a steady state of 200 breeding cows, 2,000 ewes at the moment. Gives us around about 17,000 DSE steady state and peaking up to around about 65,000 DSE April through to July. So we have a significant winter adjustment business. Other things we're doing now are transitioning out of merinos into composites, looking to build up to around about 4,000 ewes, and then also an opportunistic lamb trading business. So over the last 6 years, we've essentially been running two businesses. Firstly, a land development business, and secondly, a production business. So on the land development side of things, we've gone from 1,300, just under 1,400 hectares of irrigation up to 2,600. This presents its own issues with rotation and crop selection. So you can see here on Vaucluse, the development started in late 2015. Light blue on this side shows what it was like when we purchased. And then this is the work that we've done over the last 6 years. So one of the things with aggregating properties and reconfiguring paddocks really shows up previous management practices. So what works on one farm won't always work on the other. And when bringing new land into the rotation, as a general rule, we'd start with a fairly robust chemical fallow, apply base nutrients, including lime, all based on our soil tests. And then we'll take particular note of what plants come back first and what effects the herbicides have had on them. We purchased Glen Esk in 2016, and you can see there that there's been some fairly significant development, taking a lot of paddocks into, combining a lot of paddocks into one, which presents quite a few issues. There's different histories, different fertility, different weed burdens, etc. And the really notable thing is when you're aggregating properties together is the different management practices that have, that quite often have lasting effects. So what you do now can last 10 plus years, but conversely, what was done 10 plus years ago can still affect things today. So another thing we face is variability of soil types. On our place, if you don't like what you see, just keep walking because you will find it. And I guess the major thing I actually learned in Ag College, I did actually learn something, and it's always stuck in my mind, is that a weed is just a plant in the wrong place. And they're generally there because they like what you're doing. Or, in other words, they like the current practices. So, in other words, you've got what you've got because you're doing what you do. So, we either need to change things, i.e. how we're managing that weed, or we've got to start looking at incorporating them into our production system and just saying, well, maybe a definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. Why don't we just include it back into the grazing phase? So here's an example of one of our pivot developments. This particular area started off with 7 separate paddocks, 2 major pine tree shoulder belts through the middle of it, old silage and straw dump, old infrastructure, fences, roads, pipelines, dams, etc. So I guess you've all seen pivot developments, but so this was 2016, the first photo was taken, and then that's a grazing wheat crop taken a few days ago. As you can see, we've got a fairly highly integrated mixed farming business. We try and streamline what is quite a complex business with lots of moving parts. We've got 11 different enterprises and over 14 employees. So over the last 5 years, we've been integrating fodder crops into the crop program to help break weed cycles, transitioning between autumn and spring cropping, moving towards more spring because it's more competition and generally different to what's happened in the past. So traditionally been an autumn crop program area. We've delayed our autumn planting to avoid frost risk. Also gives us an extra chance to knock weeds. But the converse is that it's slower establishment and slower growing, so weeds have a better chance to outcompete. People quite often ask me, what's the biggest challenge in running the business? And for me, it would be the variability or the extremes we face, both between and within the season. So here are some numbers I did back in April 2020. And there's only one way to describe it. We went from one extreme to the other. So 19, we were 32% below long-term average rainfall. In the first 4 months of 2020, we had 256 mils of rain, which is 66% above our long-term average rainfall. Just to finish that, and that was actually 75% of our total rainfall in 2019. Just to complete that story, for the year ended 31 December 2020, we ended up 20% above long-term average rainfall with 620 mils of rain. If you add 2019 actual rainfall and 2020 actual rainfall, divide by 2, you end up with just under 500 mil, which is our average rainfall. So that means, we constantly have to adapt to the current conditions. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to our program. You've just got to be on your game all the time. So it means we've got to be spot on with our planning and preparation. And proper planning prevents piss poor performance. And if you don't measure it, you can't manage it. So for planning and paddock recording, we use Excel, AgWorld for cropping, My John Deere Operations Centre for inputs and harvest yield data, and AgriWeb for livestock. All of this is essential for day-to-day management, history and traceability of the product. AgWorld's our key management tool in our cropping enterprise. Our rotation is generally forecast out for the next 4 to 5 years in Excel, and we maintain records as far back as we can go pre-purchase. So in most cases, we can go back to about 2012. Crop selection takes into account previous history, the weed burden, and the stage of the development cycle. After harvest, we will review each paddock with our machinery operators and agronomists to confirm that the next scheduled crop is going to be suitable given the performance of the last crop. So for example, what issues have we had with disease, radish, ryegrass, etc. So then we move on to, once the rotation is approved by the board, I'll then go into AgWorld and put the plan into AgWorld, then set up detailed paddock records for each particular paddock. We'll then, then I'll sit with our agronomists, go through those records and make sure that we've got the right mix of chemicals and fungicides, herbicides, to make sure that we're maintaining efficacy of those herbicides. Then once we get to the actual season, we have the plan in AgWorld, we start growing the crop, and the agronomists will go into the paddock and basically update that plan according to what has to happen in terms of, do we need to change the type of chemical that we're using? Is that the right herbicide? Are they use the right rates? So as soon as that plan is taken into a recommendation, it'll get emailed to all of the people on the farm, machinery operators, etc. So what we see here, you've got AgWorld overview, for those of you that haven't had anything to do with it. Drill down to a paddock level, so that's marsh pivot, a little bit of detail in there, and then it drops down to very paddock specific information, so area, plant date, actual nutrient usage planned, yield and the herbicide groups used. So we've got that record for traceability and history. So the other thing we do is every Monday morning we have an agronomy meeting where our external paid agronomists come in and sit with cropping manager, livestock manager and main machinery operators, and we discuss how the plan is going, where we're at to date, what problems we face, and what we're looking at for the next week, what we've got coming up. So just so that we keep everybody on the same page. Very, very open with information, because givers get, the more you put into it, the more you get out of it. Yeah. So once the operators get that recommendation in AgWorld, you can see they'll get to the paddock, they'll load the input data into My John Deere, into the operations centre. Once they've completed the job, they will go into the AgWorld recommendation, mark it as complete. All of our equipment is controlled by Isobus. Calibration and recording all happens in the John Deere Operations Centre, so that we end up with detailed coverage maps for all applied inputs and harvest yield maps from anything that we harvest with our combines. So AgWorld is the main database for all our crop inputs and yields. So if we look here, we go back to, so that gives a farm overview, shows you where all the machinery is on that any one day, what they've done. Then we drill back down into paddock history. So I've gone back to marsh paddock from last year that you saw in AgWorld. That's all of the inputs that happened that year. So just so it happens they fit on one page. And then we drop down into, we've got harvest yield data there as well. So another issue we face with being a multi-enterprise business, we have multiple agronomists involved in the property. So we do take a collective whole farm holistic approach to how we manage that. You know, for example, we've got over 11 agronomists involved this year. That's our own crops, share farm crops, and straight land lease. And we stipulate in our land lease contracts that all of the paddock record information has to go into AgWorld, and we try and keep everyone up to date with our resistance status and our problem areas. Now I'm just going to have to, there he goes. So we try and operate on very much an open book. You know, so it's all about information. The more information we can get out there to people, the better the whole thing is going to run. Because, you know, as I said to you before, what we do now is going to be last 10, 20, 30 years into the future. So, and we've only got one chance to get it right. Yeah. For these programs like AgWorld, My John Deere and AgriWeb, and you've got to have someone to champion it. Because if you don't, the wheels will fall off pretty quickly, and you basically end up with garbage in equals garbage out. We collect as much information as possible from multiple channels. Field days, get involved with industry bodies, conferences, meet the scientists, talk to the experts. So this gives us access to professionals throughout southeastern Australia, which is, you know, information is king. So with our development country, well, firstly I've got to apologise for the photograph just here. There's a bit of glare there, but it really does show what I'm trying to get across with this slide. So in our development country, we use EM mapping to identify soil suitability and establish drainage lines prior to planting the crop. So we only spray areas suitable to be planted, as the weeds always thrive in the wet and bare areas. So, and it's just best to leave those non-productive areas untouched if you can. So these two photos were taken earlier this month, 6 days apart, with 30 mils of rain 5 days after planting potatoes. So you can see the pleasing thing in this one, although you probably can't quite see it in there, that water's running clear. Just to add a bit of colour to that story, was it 15, 20 days later, we had 75 mils of rain in a six-day period. So you can imagine what that would have been like if we didn't have drainage in that paddock and didn't have those grass areas. You know, and as a general rule, as farmers, we spend thousands of dollars getting water onto a paddock and bugger all time thinking about managing it once it gets there. So given our inclement climate and relatively short growing season, we can end up with some very, very tight windows to get the ideal timing with jobs. So although we try and do everything ourselves in the crop program, we'll never sacrifice timing. So if we're getting behind or look like missing a key date, we'll get a contractor in to help. There have been times during the development phase where we've had 30 plus contractors on site at any one time. The rationale behind that is that all farmers in Australia essentially do the same things. The one thing that sets people apart is timing. Making sure that the environmental and plant conditions is right is absolutely crucial. For example, making sure that clethodim is not applied pre or post frost is absolutely essential and non-negotiable in our business. Getting everybody thinking in the same way is paramount. We provide training for our spray operators. We send them to the mainland to the Advanced Spray Operators course. Send them to field days. Get them to meet the scientists. Get them to talk to them. Get them involved in the trial work. We make sure that our team is involved in setting up the trials so that they're practical and they actually get done. And then ultimately they know why we're doing what we're doing. We provide washdown bays near all our major entrances. Got to say I was a bit nervous putting a spray photo up at a thing like this, but so that's our SP sitting there. Concrete pad drains into a concrete sump, which then drains into a French drain, which is lined with crushed limestone and bluestone, just to try and manage that runoff. As I discussed previously, we have a 1,200 hectare winter fodder program. Fodder crop selection is based on breaking the weed seed phase to reduce the seed bank. So grazing wheat and paddocks with radish issues. We select stronger, faster growing crops with better disease resistance. For example, spring barley or hemp to assist in ryegrass issue paddocks. Moving towards narrower row spacing, higher seed rates, to encourage competition and shading. In our fodder program, I don't regard poor feed utilisation as waste, as it all ends up in the soil, and the livestock grazing assists in improving soil biology. We've just got to be mindful of what type of animal is grazing in sensitive paddocks. Managing the wet periods and placements of our feed pads is pretty crucial. We all have the occasional unintentional in-field trial. So this is an area that missed its pre-emergent spray prior to planting canola. So you can see that the chemical actually does work, which is pleasing. We conduct regular resistance testing for ryegrass, radish and fungicides. Use slug mats to identify pest levels prior to baiting. The other thing we've got to be mindful of is Bass Strait doesn't stop the introduction of resistant fungal spores or insects. So we're always very vigilant on our crop monitoring at all times of the year. Part of our management strategy now is to cut the headlands of all cereal paddocks for silage or whole crop hay. And this has a number of benefits. It's a guaranteed source of fodder for the agistment and livestock enterprise. Limits weed seed encroachments from fence lines, utilises a fire break in summer, and our paddock's already opened up, ready for harvest, so it doesn't matter what time we get in there with a header, everything's open and clear. Over the last 5 years, we're a lot quicker now to terminate problem areas early. So this is an example of a paddock with over 20 years of continuous dryland cropping history. Irrigation was introduced in 2018. Ryegrass was so bad in 2019, we cut silage, sprayed the regrowth, and you can still see that boom strip 2 years later. Grass was so bad in the green manure crop pre-potatoes this year, we chem fallowed it over winter. So that paddock had 4 knockdowns between April and October, and that photograph was taken just prior to the 4th knockdown. We use physical measures to help control wildlife. We've got 5 kilometres of game-proof fence. Unfortunately, every fence has an end, and game are very, very good at finding the end. Management of our roadside and railway verges is an issue, as they provide an area for weeds and pests to travel freely. For example, we've got 8 kilometres of council road, 5 kilometres of railway line running through the middle of the farm in 2 separate areas, 7 kilometres of highway frontage and 5 kilometres of river frontage, not to mention the internal streams. So we tend to manage those areas ourselves wherever we can. Finally, I've got to say that none of this, what we've done at Vaucluse, would be possible without a fantastic team of dedicated and passionate people, including our consultants and advisors. I always say that you're only ever as good as the people around you, and that the team is everything. I think for us, the management of weeds and herbicides in our business, it comes down to a multi-pronged approach. It's chemical, rotation, physical. So drainage, burning, cultivation, absolutely everything you do matters. Thank you.